Welcome to Today in Eve online. So I'm Adderall. We're looking at September 5th today, and there's been some stuff in the news, but very little, just rumors really. One of the interesting things that happened a few days ago was there was a meetup in Southern California, and I met up with a few friends, but also with Alec, who is head of Noir. And on my way out, he said, Noir is reconstituting, but don't tell anybody until it's official. So a couple days later, he released a video, and the video was cryptic candlelight saying, you think darkness is bad now, it can get worse. And then the candle is snuffed out by fingers. And it was released on, I guess it was released on YouTube and Reddit. And so an announcement that signaled the beginning of the reconstituting of a corporation called Noir. This formation of it is Noir Dot. And this is a collection of fleet commanders from different corporations that had kind of scattered after the last time Noir broke up. And they've gotten back together to roam around and put themselves out there for hire. They are a mercenary coalition. Sorry, they were in mercenary coalition. They are a mercenary corporation. That's what I meant to say. And for a long time, they were independent. And then later, they joined the mercenary coalition, which is also a mercenary group, but much larger. And they were a part of that until that slowed down and broke up a year ago, or maybe more. So Noir, again, is a corporation that is back. They are ready to be hired, used as the instrument of policy. They will go out and fight your fights for you if you pay them their wages. So again, Noir Dot is back, and they are newly reformed with a group of the two guys that you will probably know the best. Anybody who's listening to this, work and build the Declarations of War podcast. And so that's Alec, I think he's the leader. And of course, you know, Artemis Albosa from Talking in Stations. He's also part of that podcast. So yeah, those guys are around, and it's neat to see a group come together to break away from large organizations and form a small organization that's going to go out and do some stuff together and have some fun. So look out for that. On the flip side, we have Iron Armada, which was, well, they were a corporation, but they formed an alliance around their corporation. And they lived in Nullsec, I believe, mostly in Syndicate area, and then maybe Pureblind, maybe Fountain, I'm not sure, but essentially the west side of the map. They were kind of kicking around for a long time now, since at least the Phoebe jump changes, which I think shrunk all the empires because it limited force projection. And so with limited force projection, since you couldn't really dominate a bigger area, a lot of empires shrunk down in size, leaving areas where smaller groups could jump in and, find some solve of their own. And one of those groups was Iron Armada. It was independent. It was always, I wouldn't say fiercely independent, but they definitely made a point of it that they were not part of a larger group. But as time went on, and they were a medium alliance, they were independent. As time went on, they seemed to be more aligned with the Imperium. And I'll talk about that in just a second. One of the things that happened to them again, I believe this was Fountain, is when they started having Sov, no, it was Pureblind actually. Early on, I think the new warfare, new Sov warfare with Entosis mechanics, allowed them to move into pure blind and kind of take over and test out what a small group could do, and they took over some space. And I believe they were there for a little while before Pandemic Legion kind of came in and decided to take them out for some reason. They just wanted that strategic system that they had, so they came in and just wiped them out pretty bad. So when something like that happens in EVE Online, you don't get over it very quickly. And I think Iron Armada at that point considered Pandemic Legion an enemy, I think. And so then, as months and months go by, and Iron Armada is now maybe fighting in Syndicate or fighting Galente or fighting with Galente. They're basically faction war area stuff. The Imperium moves north at a certain point in 2018, wanting to attack Pandemic Legion and Northern Coalition. And at that point, Iron Armada didn't have anything to say about it, but they their system was used as a staging system for the Imperium. And there's two ways to look at that. One is that they didn't resist that. Of course, they're much smaller than the Imperium. No point in really resisting, but they didn't join any effort to resist it as well. And so from a certain perspective, you can see that as cooperation. And at that point, I think people thought of them as kind of the next iteration of blue status or ally status to the Imperium. You have the Imperium proper that's centered with Goonswarm, the biggest group that leads that coalition and organizes it essentially. Then you have groups that have dedicated themselves to being a part of that, like Bastion, for instance, or TNT. Then outside of those groups, you have groups that are in cooperation and affiliation and technically part of the Imperium, and that would be a group like the Initiative. But they're seen as more independent. They go out and they do their own things. They don't necessarily wait for the Imperium to decide to do a thing. And then you have groups like Snuff that kind of coexist and depend on the Imperium, or did in the past. In fact, they were actually part of the Imperium at one point before they broke away. And they're not necessarily allies, but when push comes to shove, it's not understood where they actually stand. But they are very, very good allies of the Initiative, which is a part of the Imperium. So it creates some complication, but you can see the gray area starting to get grayer from black to white. It's starting to get grayer and lighter. And then you get to a group like Iron Armada that was not necessarily part of the Imperium. They weren't part of the Imperium at all. They were under name at all. Were they cooperating with Imperium? Possibly. Or were they just subject to Imperium because Imperium's so much bigger? We don't know. But all this to say that they have made it official, and that corporation that was inside of an alliance, basically a corporation was the alliance, has now folded into or merged with, or I think the corporation itself has moved into Goonswarm. So they are now proper Goonswarm, proper Imperium. And that was about 80 fighters, I think 80 players. It's Exxon from Fuedet, who is someone who used to FC against them and fight them, says, from what I understand, Iron Armada and Init reset each other fairly recently. That's probably changed now that they're in Goonswarm. Yeah, that is that whatever animosity was there or whatever may still be there, but they definitely are not allowed to shoot each other now. And I should say, a friend of mine that I worked with at EN24 and had on the EN24 podcast when I was doing that, Tridget, was the leader for Iron Armada. And he was kind of the cult of personality in that corporation. So the guys that were in there because they had a lot of value for his leadership. And he's a nice guy, good guy. And you see him at eVegas once or twice. And he's held them together for a long time, and now I don't know if he moved them into the Imperium or Goonswarm, but I'm sure it was done with his blessing since he created that group. Okay, yeah. So Fuedet would fight with them too. Fuedet would have a coalition with them and Fed Up against Snuff and their allies. Okay, that's really good to know. That's kind of what I thought. It's a little bit ambiguous to me, but you had like Fed Up is part of Galente militia at one point, and Fuedet is faction war Reddit essentially. So that's Fuedet. And they would sometimes group up in order to defend themselves and fight against more or less the bullies in low sec, which would be Snuff. That's snuffed out. And I guess that group was called the Iron Federation. They make a lot of chicken jokes in Fuedet, and I'm not exactly sure why, but it is their mascot. So anyway, all that to say, yeah, the landscape is changing a little bit, even in smaller ways than what we normally report on. And so you have a group that reconstitutes itself as a small corporation, a small, agile, and fierce group, Noir, and says, we're here to be hired to fight these small fights and get out there and take advantage of this blackout situation that nullsec is in. And then you have groups like Iron Armada that were about 80 people big that are folding into Goon Swarm because it's probably better for their existence. In other words, their players need more people around them to be able to do things. I don't exactly know what the reasons were, but usually when you see this, it's called Y-dotting, and that's an EVE Online term for merging your corporation or alliance into a larger group in order to give your guys the ability to play more with other people because your group is maybe too small or too inactive. And that's what Y-dotting is. And that term comes from something that happened in EVE history where Wildly Inappropriate, that was an alliance that was a pretty big alliance for a long time. They kind of kicked around the medium level of alliances. The leader for Wildly Inappropriate decided that he'd had enough. He wanted to do something else and opened it up to his group to say, what do we want to do? Do we want to stop playing, or do we want to merge over with these other guys in Goon Swarm? And the result was that alliance folded into Goon Swarm, much like Iron Armada did. And from one perspective, from the Imperium perspective or Goon Swarm perspective, they thought that was a very prudent way to keep players playing without taking them with you out of the game and without leaving them without a leader. It was a good managerial decision, and it was the best interest of the Wildly Inappropriate. So it was a leader looking out for his guys, moving them into a place where they could be better taken care of. And that's where Y-dot came from. The alternative view of that from people who did not want to go and become part of Goon Swarm for whatever reason was that the decision was made either unfairly or prematurely or whatever, and that they basically got scuttled into a bigger organization, and who knows what rewards the guy was given, if any. So those are the 2 points of view about what Y-dotting is. Some people see it as a hostile takeover of an independent group. It's basically like the large Imperium or the large Goon Swarm group taking over their allies and folding them into themselves like a big greedy monster. And the alternative view to that, the Imperium Goon Swarm view, is it's a responsible decision by a leader not to kill his corporation, but to bring it new life by bringing it into a larger group. So once again, all that to say, that is what Y-dotting is. Iron Armada has moved into Goon Swarm. It might be a Y-dot type situation, or it might just be something else. And all this to say, again, you have groups that are breaking off from other groups like, I don't know where all the Noir FCs come from, but they come from a lot of them come from larger groups like NC or PL or somewhere else. And they're coming back to constitute a small independent group, and then you have a small independent group falling into a larger group. So the movements are happening in both directions, and I think it's really interesting. You guys have any thoughts on that? All right. Let's look at what's going on in the forums. As I was browsing this, one thing jumped out to me. It's around here, number 3. It says, Razer recruiting, hashtag you found Razer. And I wanted to explain that. Well, first of all, that's a recruiting post, which most people know that when you're recruiting for new players, you put it in the forums, you put it everywhere you can. A group like Test Alliance is famous for any little itty bitty media time they get. They always say Reddit is recruiting or Dreddit is recruiting. So that's a little joke, right? And so one of the places is Eve forums. That's where the players are, some of them. And here you have Razer recruiting, hashtag you found Razer. What happened with Razer, it was a very strong alliance at a certain point early on in EVE Online. I would say 2000. I believe they performed really well in 2006, 2007, 2008, as far as the alliance tournament goes. But they were also kind of a big group inside of the proper Northern Coalition. Not NC Dot. You remember that dot means it's a different group. It was actually Northern Coalition, which was mostly Morsis Mihi and Razer were the two of the big alliances there that kind of held the peace. And then there was a lot of little alliances that would kind of hover around them. And they were all in the north, and they would protect each other. That was what they were, like a big passive beast. In some ways, they're very much like the Imperium today, where they built an empire. Well, I think you could say the Imperium is a bit more hostile in some of the things they do, and whether that's good or bad for the game is up to you. But they were a conglomerate of, I believe they were more peaceful, more defense oriented. But of course, everybody wanted to destroy them because they looked like they could be farmed. Basically, go up there and you just beat up on them over and over again. And a lot of attempts were made to destroy Northern Coalition. And that actually didn't happen until much later when the Russians decided to do it, and they actually did do it. They destroyed Northern Coalition. So again, that Northern Coalition, that original one, the big groups were Morsis Mihi and Razer. Yeah, real quick note, side note, sorry to get off track, but Doom was a corporation that I fought alongside with in 2010, I think, up in the north, and Doom was always trying to kill Northern Coalition. And one of the leaders of Doom was Vince Draken, and Vince Draken is a leader of NC Dot. So when Northern Coalition Dot formed, they did it as a prank against the proper Northern Coalition so that people would have a lot of trouble talking about Northern Coalition. You wouldn't know which one you were talking about. And Northern NC Dot never really was built to exist very long. They had one mission to destroy NC, the Northern Coalition. And once that happened, NC Dot kept going, and that's how they got their name, and that's why it's so confusing. But Doom and Vince were amazing players, very, very tough players. They were older players in that they'd been around the game for a while, and they used to just do some really, really bold fleets right up into the staging ground of Morsis Mihi and camp them into their own station. And this was a much smaller group, so it was a lot more noticeable, when a small group could be really tough. But yes, again, back to Razer, Northern Coalition. You found Razer, and the reason they say you found Razer hashtag was during the Casino War or the World War B, whatever you want to call it. They were supposed to be an ally to the Imperium. They were actually in the Imperium, I believe. And when the Imperium was attacked in 2016, the spring, Razer just couldn't produce fleets. So they'd have 3 or 4 Razer guys. And this is supposed to be a group of thousands of accounts, maybe hundreds of players. And they just could not show up for whatever reason. Either they just weren't there anymore, or who knows? But everybody kept saying, "Where's Razer? Where's Razer?" And there was a lot of joking about, "Oh, I found Razer," and it was one guy like in some completely far off system that got destroyed. And so the joke became, "Where's Razer?" And so now when it says, now that Razer's back in recruiting, it says you found Razer. So that's the joke, that here they are and they're still alive. Morse's Mihi, by the way, was run by Lockvu, I think, or something like that. Voklau. Thank you. Voklau. And Voklau, V-O-K and then L-A or something like that, was actually a dude's name. And good morning, Major Sniper. And he, so he ran it, and his number 2 was a player named Mirana. And so I think eventually that corporation that ran Morse's Mihi ended up, well, they ended up going, after they were destroyed by the Russian coalition that came up and destroyed them, Morse's Mihi fell down into Delve. And at the time, Delve was occupied by, essentially it was under the purview of AAA, Against All Authorities. And AAA had some alliances that they were kind of mentoring. And one of those alliances was Nully Secunda, who was living in Delve with the permission of AAA. And AAA was also an ally with Red Alliance. And so Red Alliance was having some problems as well. So AAA said, well, why don't you move into Delve as well? And, you can have some systems in there. And they did that without the permission of Nully Secunda, or without consulting Nully Secunda. So Nully was really annoyed that Red Alliance was all of a sudden given space in Delve. So they started fighting over Delve, and that's what AAA said, hey, fight for the space. So 2 allies of AAA are fighting it out in Delve. And then here comes Morse's Mihi, who is collapsed and falls into that same area, because they figure well, we're big enough to take either one of those groups, so we'll go down there and dominate it. And it did not end well for them because they were too demoralized. So Morse's Mihi was defeated in Delve. Red Alliance eventually, I think it was pretty much a draw, or they eventually left. And then Test was growing up and wanted to test its strength, so it came down to Delve and started fighting with Nully Secunda as well. And Pandemic Legion was in the area because there was a lot of people fighting in that area, and they wanted to be a part of that. All that was called the Thunderdome, the Delve Thunderdome. And that happened not right before the Fountain War, but so this would be about 2012, 2013, but around that time. Okay, again, when Morse's Mihi came down, it had in its leadership Voklau and Mirana. And after their defeat there, I don't know exactly what happened. I can't go into Morse's Mihi history. I wasn't there. Or the corporation that I'm talking about. I think do you know what that corp's called? Is it 519 or something? It has a very simple name. That corporation ended up going into Goonswarm. And Mirana ended up working in Goonswarm's diplomatic sector. And she was a protege to Scion. I guess that's a way of saying it. And Mirana then took Scion's place as essentially the head of the diplomatic section of Goonswarm, which essentially is the diplomatic section of the Imperium. And Mirana is a friend of mine. We work together at Imperium News because she's a very good organizer and project manager. 4S, that's the corporation. Thank you, 4S. So Mirana's from 4S, and she is the head of diplomacy for the Imperium. And that's how that all worked together. Voklau, unfortunately, was caught trading ISK for real money and thrown out of the game, but he was pretty much through with the game by that point. But that ended his career completely. I think he was a Serbian guy, if I'm not mistaken, or Eastern European, I think. Yeah, anyway. So that's the story for Razer. Razer went missing during, the World War B Casino War, and now they're reemerging. So they're saying they're playing along with the meme. Hey, you found Razer, here we are. So I thought that was pretty cool. Welcome back. I actually really liked Razer. I wanted to join them at one point. It was a little intimidating because they had a good name from the Alliance tournament. Thank you. Vaclav was Serbian. That's what it was. It's a lot of good Serbian players, actually. I'm thinking Pfeiffer. Well, I won't get into it. I guess that's too close to saying, whatever. That's their real life. But there are a lot of good players from Serbia. And Hungary has a lot of good players. It's interesting. We'll talk about that some other time. Back to this. So Razer's recruiting. I wanted to join them at one point. I really like their name, and I didn't know much about their culture, but they seemed pretty cool. They definitely had a good Alliance tournament presence, which at the time, having a good presence in the Alliance tournament, it wasn't about the prizes. It was about the reputation. And that was important. It's an important distinction with the Alliance tournament. You had people who were fighting for reputation to say, like, we're a really good fighting outfit if you want to join us. And winning the Alliance tournament, or not even winning it, but just placing really well or performing well and having the announcers talk you up, was something that really helped recruitment. And I know that because from the other side of it, when I was a younger player, I was looking at the Alliance tournament thinking like, wow, those guys are really good. I want to join them. That was one avenue of showing off your skill in an environment that didn't really have blobbing where you had more guys than the other or any of that kind of stuff. It was pure PvP prowess. The Pandemic Legion recruited heavily based on their reputation of winning many Alliance tournaments. Early on, the Alliance tournaments were dominated by the strongest group in the game at the time, which was Band of Brothers. And so, again, the Alliance tournament was not just for prize money, it was for reputation of the Alliance. And that is a key difference to what it's become, because now a lot of key players have formed smaller groups and changed the name. Like Skill U was essentially... they're actually called Skill Yourself, and they were trying to use that name to get the announcers of the Alliance tournament to say that on air, but they couldn't say that on air, so they said Skill You. You also have, of course, the dominant group of players, Hydra Reloaded, and then, what's the other Hydra group? Vidra, right.
With a V.
With a V. So the point is you have groups that distinguish themselves as a small group of players, but not as an alliance. And they don't really bring recruitment. They're not trying to win for that reason. They're trying to win for the prizes. Yeah, it's Vidra Reloaded. I'm not sure if they won the last one, but it was Hydra versus Vidra in the final, which was kind of anticlimactic for me. What were you going to say?
I think it's Vidra Reloaded, like with the
Reloaded.
LOL in that. Yeah, I think it's that.
Yeah.
At the time, people were a little bit sort of because the names are so close to each other. People thought that it was actually some kind of like sort of meta, like match fixing kind of thing going on, but it wasn't. That wasn't the case.
So they weren't being ironic because Hydra was implicated in match fixing. I think with Outcast or somewhere.
Yeah, Hydra had been kind of deemed to have been match fixing at one point. Vidra wasn't. Vidra was just riffing. It was just a bunch of people who really wanted to play and do extremely well in the Alliance tournament, but they wanted to basically. I think they were just playing on Hydra's name.
Yeah.
Just for the lols, as they say.
Well, maybe we'll talk about Alliance history. I actually did a lot of research on Alliance tournament for my first few articles that I started writing, like in 2013, 14. And there was a lot of rich stuff there. But the Alliance tournament ended up evolving into something else, which was just incredibly good performance out of small groups of players that didn't really have a connection outside of that as far as the group that was fighting. So where you would have a group like Goonswarm, a big dominant group inside the game, they'd be in the Alliance tournament and they would place okay. Test actually was in there a long time before they started performing really well. Nulli Segunda wasn't any good at the Alliance tournament until they essentially got Hungarians on their team. I think that's, what's that group called? Free Gates or something. And that corporation was really good. And NC also didn't do very well in the tournament until they got some, really good dedicated team of players. So, so even though the tournament has like, there are definitely known names in the tournament, heroes of the tournament. It seems like it's more like a race car, like a Formula One situation where you have small teams that are they're really funded by the Alliance, but they're not necessarily part of the Alliance in general, kind of going out and being sponsored by these alliances to really win the tournament and to get those prizes, because those ships are worth billions and billions and actually hundreds of billions. So it really became more about the prizes than about the prestige of recruitment. And I thought that was a real unfortunate development because there was a disconnect. And so again, you have groups like Hydra that really, I think they were low-sec pirates, but they weren't even around in game until the tournament came around, and then they kind of come around. Yeah, Vidra, that does have some people that play all the time. Like I think Suetonia was part of Vidra Reloaded. And you had Skill U, which had a couple really good FCs. But you also had Pen is Out. Again, another trick name so they could get announcers to say penis out, which I think is a British thing. I don't know. But the point is, it became more about the meme culture, infiltrating really good PvPers in small groups. And occasionally some of those groups would get co-opted and sponsored by bigger alliances. But the idea that an alliance was producing the FCs, producing those players, seems to have kind of gone into the back. And if it is not that way, that is the impression, at least that I have after watching it for a long time. Right? It's been around since 2004. Actually, more like 2005. The first Alliance tournament wasn't an Alliance tournament. It was actually called the Caldari Championships. And it was an RP'd PvP fight among three ships. I think they were one battleship, one frigate, and one cruiser. And that was the team. It was 3 people. So it was like a 3-on-3. Yeah. So yeah, the guys that pilot for the Alliance tournament teams, people are telling me where the Alliance tournament teams are, and I appreciate that. Again, are in the game. Some come and go with the tournament, but by and large, the idea that a name in the game represented the players who are fighting in the tournament has been diluted at the very least. Okay, let's move on. Getting back on track. I wanted to point this out, that the local comms blackout discussion thread, you can join that. This is actually the second, part 2 is up to 30,000 views. I think that one must be locked because there is no, that replies or views. Yeah, that's not replies. I think that's views. But I do know that the some of the threads that are coming out about blackout and the changes that are happening that people have mixed feelings about, those threads are breaking the forum's limits, and so they're having to start a second thread. That's why you see this part due. They probably reached the 10,000 reply maximum and have started up again. What else have we got here? People selling stuff like characters. And yeah, and so that's it. I think this one was last week or yesterday. Anyway, check out eForums. Interesting stuff there. We'll also look at Reddit, which is the uncensored area for EVE players that want to go and not be censored. SkillQ, if you use that, I've never heard of it, but skillq.net went down. I think that was posted by the zKillboard administrator, Squiz. And yeah, okay. So one of the other things that we've been hearing about, and you might look out for this, it's early on because this is just on the test server. And it's actually hard for me to describe. Let's see if I can get a smart guy in here to describe it. I'll just kidnap this guy and this guy. All right, Nero and Bard Ghost, you've been kidnapped. Oh, Nero fell out. Bard Ghost, are you here?
I'm here, but I got to run off really quick. Well, what do you want quick? Sorry.
TLDR of what changes you were talking about earlier with those NPCs?
Roaming Triglavians, do you mean?
Yep.
Okay, so the roaming ones are getting Scramming Damaviks and Scramming Kikamoras, and they also seem to be getting a conduit gate that they will come through. Maybe as a warning to people in system that it's about to get slightly more dangerous, because you don't really want to just spring them on people.
Got it.
And then the other thing, I don't know if anyone else has said, is the World Arc site is now being put behind I can't remember quite what it was, but it's basically being gated. So everything that goes in has to go from one point. Or at least that's what it appears to be on the test server at the moment.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, man. Take off.
Cheers.
All right. So I would interpret that for you, but that was pretty easy to understand, except for me. I didn't understand it. But there's some stuff going on. All that is in the test server, so that is not in the game. Let's make that clear. Just some things that people are looking at in the test server about NPC changes that are happening there. And we'll see what happens over here. Another thing that came out, and this is really interesting. This is something we talked about a few days ago, and you can find it. I think it's called, it's one of our previous shows. It's called Jita Trade Hub. And that was also something that we looked at on the test center. So it's not in the game either. It's still not in the game. And that was a few days ago. And that was the building of the Caldari Jita 44 station, Caldari Space. And it's called, and now it's actually in the lore, it looks like. It's the CEP and Caldari Navy Greenlight Jita 44 expansion. PKN Interstellar Consortium seals contracts. So they're basically saying that it's been approved for an upgrade. And so what's going to be happening in the next few months, and I don't know how long it will take, it might take, I assume, as long as a year, is you're going to see different stages of Jita being built bigger. And that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, they're renovating it. They're adding up an outside pool.
An outside pool. There are pictures of that, but check out that. You can find those somewhere on the internet. Well, that is everything that I wanted to look at today. Do you have anything, Mr. McLeod?
Not as such. There's been a couple of like interesting things been discussed in Talking Station's public channel earlier on today, but actual basis for it is quite light. So
Yeah.
I won't speculate.
There's one other thing here, and that is the September patch, quality of life. They call those QOL changes. There is one that's coming out, and you will see this is already up on updates.eveonline.com. And it is the fittings window. I'll just bring that up. The fittings window is going to warn you when you're doing something that won't work. And you can see the alert
or
right
might
here.
not be beneficial to your fit.
Yeah, so it'll give you a little description. The flag will jump out. You'll see a little warning sign in the top left when you're fitting things. You'll also see yellow circles on the module that you're putting in. And this is meant for new players, which a majority of the work that CCP is doing, a large majority, I think like 70% of their effort right now is for new players and making it more understandable and easy to play EVE Online. Not easy to play the game, but easy to understand a very complex game. And that's a hard problem. But this is one of the ways they can do it, is give you contextual information as you're doing something, right or wrong. So this Ev team has been working on this package of tweaks, fixes, and improvements for the September 2019 release. These changes, with a couple exceptions, are primarily focused on improving the experience for pilots in their first few hours and days of New Eden. That's an important point, first few hours. And that's important because a lot of players get frustrated within an hour or two. Wait, you have an open mic, McLeod.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So it's all right. A lot of new players have really are in the game minutes before they look at it and are overwhelmed and say, I can't understand what I'm looking at. This game is not for me, and take off. So there's a big effort to work on the players within the first minute that they decide to download it. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to keep people interested enough to start to learn the complexity and see the beauty in the design and all that kind of stuff. If you want to say that. Maybe I'm overstating the fact there's beauty in the design, but I think the complication is very attractive. There's a lot of people who think the complication is overwhelming. So they're probably trying to help that out by giving you contextual information as you look at things and touch things that say, here is a problem or here is an opportunity right there when you're doing it. So it's all very related. Because one of the problems that EVE Online has is that something won't work that you're trying and you don't know why. It just doesn't work. And that's a big problem.
That's a very interesting point. And even CCP developers have said in the past that they didn't change any game mechanics whatsoever, but just because they changed how the UI looks around specific game mechanics, that increased player retention significantly. Because people, it's not Excel sheets online anymore. It's more an animated UI that looks good and it's intuitive.
Yeah. Well, and that's when somebody says, "Oh, I'm going to play this EVE Online video game," they expect to see a video game. When they come into it, if they don't see something that you can interact with that is meaningful, then I think they see very few options for entertainment because they can't even participate. They're locked out of participation already. But what's interesting to me, something you said, is spreadsheets. EVE Online, and you'll still see this out there, in 2003 through when it started, and 2008 had a really big reputation for being a difficult game, but also being a spreadsheet game. And that is attractive to a lot of players in EVE Online, right? A game with complexity that you have to figure out through spreadsheets. A spreadsheet game is attractive to people who know how to really use spreadsheets well. It's not attractive to everybody else. So they've been trying to shake that reputation for a long, long time. And the more they get away from that interface where you essentially have to click on something and right click and go 3 or 4 levels deep into the menu to find the one little thing that you want to do. For instance, if you're in space and you want to fly to a moon, you have to right click, go to planets, then go out to moons, and then pick the right moon. That's like 3 or 4 steps out into, when an FC said get to moon 15 or whatever. So you're already like using an interface is very, very clunky for the kind of agile gameplay you're supposed to be having. So again, all this work that's going into it will help everybody that enjoys the playing the video game aspect of EVE. And these sorts of things will especially help people who want to comprehend and have information on the spot as they do things. So that's what that is. It's a new quality of life change. There'll be multiple changes because it says here plural, but this is just one of them. Fitting warnings. As you fit the ship, you'll be warned if what you're doing is plausible or even advisable. Okay, that's all I have today. I actually want to get these programs down to a half hour so that people can consume them. If we actually make too much programming, it's great for truck drivers and people on planes, but people who have short commutes essentially will have to just miss a lot of content because we assume everybody has like a 20-minute commute. So we want to get these down to about 20 minutes. So we're getting closer. I want to thank everybody for showing up. Thanks, McLeod and Z-Master, for talking today. And we will see you tomorrow on Today in EVE.